Good evening. This is Mae Brussell on KAZU FM in Pacific Grove, California. It's broadcast number 569. I will not be doing the entire evening or even a large segment on John DeLorean. He has to be put on the shelf till next week. It's a big story, but the murder of Kevin Mulcahy is primary in my mind, and also other news events that did take place. We'll get back to DeLorean. The fact that he had Joseph Ball, the Warren Commission, the CIA attorney representing him, gives you some inkling, as I mentioned last week, of the importance of DeLorean, but he'll be around for a long time, like Watergate. His case and his entanglements and businesses will be in the news for years to come, so we can put him on the shelf for another week. I just want to mention in passing or laughing, his wife, the famous model Christina Ferrari, is putting on a fashion show because she's going to keep her commitment November 14th for the American Cancer Society in New Jersey. Her husband would save his $500,000 a year salary, and he's running around between his 3 mansions and all over the world selling $60 million worth of narcotics, heroin and cocaine in Los Angeles and Hollywood area in exchange for his high style of living and his place in Dublin. She's so altruistic, she wants to keep her commitment. They're very honorable people, you understand. The American Cancer Society is a political ripoff ever since the end of World War II, when Elmer Bobst of Warner Lambert took it over, also from New Jersey. So she's going to go there for the fashion show. It means nothing, but I think for laughs it's kind of funny. Western Airlines boss Neil Burke is thinking of quitting. That was in the news this week. If you're interested in Neil Burke and Western Airlines and the fellow who was able to get the C-130s over to Libya, which has to do again with Edwin Wilson and Kevin Mulcahy, you can get the broadcast I did last February 7th and 8th. That's broadcast 531 and 532. Very important. It had to do with the air crash of Air Florida outside of Washington, D.C., the sabotage of that plane, the battle between Western Airlines and MGM with Mr. Kerkorian and Neil Burke, the hidden money. The main thing is the hidden money. He went over to Europe, brought back $50 million to buy Wien Air Alaska, W-I-E-N. Those 2 broadcasts and several more on that tragedy and the sabotage of that plane had to do with the political shenanigans, the hidden money, the overseas money that's invested to buy whole corporations. And now that money's dried up, when Roberta Calvi was hanging with that off the bridge, the Blackfriars Bridge in London in June, missing June the 10th and found hanging June the 18th, it was a major shift for organizations, individual studios. Many people would die, many people would quit. There'll be exposures, there'll be changes of jobs, because the money man tied to the $1.2 billion that the Vatican has in the Panama banks and won't tell where it is, and the 200 million banks that were affected by it are changing many things. The London banks, the British royal family, a lot of people are scrounging around and affected by this. In fact, I believe it affected the life and death of Grace Kelly. So you're going to see major job changes, and I'll be pointing from time to time people that I've referred to in the past who are now making shifts of some kind, and I believe it's related to those broadcasts that I did before. So Neil Burke may quit Western Airlines. He's having trouble accordingly in the money problem, and that $50 million that came from Wien originally, that's in the newspapers this week. Switzerland is extraditing Flavio Carboni, C-A-R-B-O-N-I, F-L-A-V-I-O. Flavio Carboni, he's a contractor who had a big part with Roberta Calvi in Italy with the P2 scandal, the Masonic scandal, the Vatican, the Banco Ambrosiano. He's been in Switzerland. They're now going to extradite him to Italy. The big fish, Licio Gelli, who was arrested in Switzerland, and Grace Kelly had her accident the next day, and the fatal accident and the direct links to Monte Carlo and Licio Gelli's Masonic Lodge. He's still in Switzerland. He has not gone back to Italy yet. He's the big fish from the whole era, from Franco to Hitler to Argentine, Juan Perón, you name it. He's still in Switzerland. If you're worrying about the family in Monaco or the grieving, their grieving is officially over. I saw a picture of them at church and said their mourning is over for Grace. Right now they're at the Lyford Cay Club down in the Bahamas, vacationing on a $2.5 million yacht. They flew into Heathrow Airport. in London, and then they went from Nice to London. And Prince Rainier and the three adult children, they're not children anymore, are down in the Bahamas. A listener to World Watcher sent me a picture of Prince Albert in the Vatican with his mother when she filmed the Christmas and the Easter program, and the note on the picture was, will Albert take over from Grace as he becomes the head of Monaco, the secret role or so forth. Yeah, I guess he's down there looking at the vaults and banks. Remember that Paul Marcinkus, the treasurer of the Vatican Bank, the great connector of all these various elements from organized crime into the Vatican, and the subject of that book, The Vatican Connection. Marcinkus is locked up inside the Vatican. He couldn't travel with the Pope to Spain on this trip or anywhere else. He'll be arrested. He's still inside the Vatican, so they took Archbishop Glemp from Poland. They have to have a money bag to get the money into Poland because they're planning a revolution there, so the American troops having a chance to get in and get into Poland and start World War III. Glemp is around there traveling with the Pope. Marcinkus is locked up. He was on the board of the bank in Nassau and had to get off. That's the treasurer and bodyguard for the Pope. And Princess Grace's children are now down, the son and heir to the throne, in the Bahamas. And I'm sure that he'll be instructed about where some of the cash is kept. All of these kinds of monarchies have offshore locations for safety in case the throne collapses. The royal family from Monaco is now down there, neck collar and all. They seem to have survived that and are down in a very important place in the Bahamas. There was a story of John DeLorean flew down the Cayman Islands to one of his secret bank accounts, forgot the key, and had to have someone fly down and bring him the key. But these kids are getting the tour, I'm sure. All the major people involved in the scandals in the past years are flying all over the globe, and we don't even have time to tell you why they're there and what they're doing, but from time to time I will help you with that. Based upon my past research. Very important, the way the Pope went to Spain. He was told, you may not come here till the elections are over. They believed that he was trying to throw it into another right-wing government, the first time since the revolution in 1936, when it began, the Spanish Revolution, that the government was able to change hands. And if the Pope isn't killed, maybe the government will stand a chance, but if he is killed there will be a coup of the military. This happened in Guatemala last year. There was an election there, and then there was a coup afterwards, and the military took over anyway. The election didn't mean anything, and a man from Ukiah, Jim Jones' acquaintance, a Christian leader trained in America, is now the president of Guatemala, and the bloodbath down there is horrendous. As I say, these people want you back into the Middle Ages, whether it's the Children's Crusade or the Inquisition. And the important thing is to stop them, if you can, at every point where they turn a road and take on a new angle. The Spanish government was able to say to the Pope, you cannot come to our country until after the election. He's very welcome there by the masses, but they didn't want, his poster was replacing the candidate's poster. And for the first time since 1936, the government has been able to change hands. John Dean has come out with a new book, and Time magazine has excerpts, and it was in the news. Alexander Haig was deep throat. If you don't have the broadcast that I had, 549 is the number of it, June 14th, 1982. I did an anniversary of Watergate and went into the background of Alex Butterfield in Australia in the Army, and how Alexander Haig called him and said, come on to Washington now and put Butterfield in to tape the president. They planned to kill him down in San Diego. The convention was changed to Miami. Haig orchestrated the whole thing, and along with Henry Kissinger, the two protégés of that very important Nazi Fritz Kramer that I talk about, who's in our Defense Department. And it's very natural that Haig could and would be deep throat, because he is a traitor. Henry Kissinger is a traitor. And the sooner we get rid of these rotten people and show them for what they are, the better. Haig's sister was defending him yesterday in the paper. Incidentally, her name is Regina Meredith, and her middle name is Haig, and she's from Princeton and Trenton, New Jersey, Alexander Haig's sister. Haig was on TV making a comment just as he passed, defending himself. He said, I wasn't even in the White House until May of 1963. Well, the charges are meeting somebody in a basement at 2 in the morning. So Haig is a head of NATO and a military. He wasn't a military commander. He was a political appointee to NATO. Could be even a little more logical. I think the answer he could have given to this question of John Dean when he was accused of being deep throat was, where were you, John Dean, while I was doing it? because John Dean testified before the Senate Select Committee and was able to get Richard Nixon out of office, which is what they wanted, by exposing the tapes, which is what Alexander Haig was in charge of, and Mr. Butterfield. And so Dean is part of the team who is splintered off it doesn't matter if he makes a buck if he's telling the truth. And this is the first clink or chink into the armor of Alexander Haig. The sooner they all fall, the better, and I hope that as they fight each other, more comes out. But just mentioning him as Deep Throat did my heart good, because I know he's rotten. And not that Nixon was perfect, but those guys are foul. And the sooner the better. If they are bad, that the people out there, more of them recognize them for what they are. They've been built up and blown up like huge balloons, and my little needle isn't going to pop. It's going to take some help from you and a few more people, and there are a lot of good books coming out on this subject. Now, the National Examiner had the story I was talking about that I wrote. It came out 2 weeks after I mentioned it, Why Grace Was Murdered. It was a fairly good article for what they could do. This Cliff Leindecker, we did it on the phone, and he tape recorded it, but they're short of space. But it's a good article. There's my picture of my favorite people, the Auschwitz Pope, Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, the one from Cicero, Illinois, and Roberta Calvi and Grace Kelly. And if you don't have this, because they come out so quickly and they're off the stand, I'll make copies for you, and if you send me a self-addressed stamped envelope, has to do that. I have too much mail. Send me a self-addressed stamped envelope. I'll send you a copy of the National Examiner article, Why Princess Grace Was Murdered. Now, Pat Robertson of the 700 Club, and this is very important. He's on TV every week. He's one of these big Christian church people, and I claim that the Vatican money and the money missing out of all of these banks, these hundreds of millions of dollars into the billions and billions, is going to put these world Christian organizations that John Connolly and Gerald Ford are part of, and Clement Stone, turn the whole world Christian, are going into radio Christian work. Now, Pat Robertson on the 700 Club last week, on the 29th of October, on Friday, I believe, had on his program that the National Examiner, the same paper that this was in, was linked to the occult and the devil. Now, the important thing is that not only was my article in there with the pictures of the Vatican itself and the Pope and the suggestion of murdering of people, which is in the courts, and people being charged for murder, many murders who are directly linked to the Vatican, but there also was a story in there on the escape of Hitler to the Antarctica and with a Nazi border, and it's a continuous series. There was one last week, this week, and there'll be one next week on Eva Braun and Hitler. Again, one of my favorite subjects, not done by a psychic. People were concerned when I referred to the Examiner and some of the stories on Hitler's escape, don't associate yourself with a psychic. I said that they put that in to prepare people for what they would do later. You have to understand, read the media as much as I do, to get the code words or the phrasing or the preparation. Those early things were to prepare people for the shock, and then they bring in the hard researchers with the actual facts. And the Hitler escape isn't much different than what I've been saying on the air, if you've been listening to me for the last 5 or 10 years. But if you haven't, it's worth having, and even if you listen, it's worth having. And I'll copy that article and put it on the back of the Princess Grace story. But Pat Robertson was saying on the air that he's going to continuously link the occult and demonism to the National Examiner. Now, there's some papers that compete, the Star and the National Enquirer, and then the Globe and Examiner are owned by the same people. But they singled out the Examiner that is having the stories on the Nazis and on the Vatican. And the reason it's so important is that Pat Robertson worked down in Peru with J. Peter Grace. There's a book on the pirates of Peru, the emptying of the minerals out of Peru, the political life of the Grace family. J. Peter Grace, the head of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, whose allegiance is to the Vatican above the United States, the co-partner with Otto Ambrose, for years, long association and the Flick organization with Nazi war criminals, but Ambrose, of course, who designed Zyklon B and got the patent for IG Farben, and again, headquarters in New Jersey and in Nazi Germany with over 750 corporations now. He's going to talk and compare the Examiner to demonism and the occult. Well, to smear it doesn't mean much, and to have it on top of the articles of the Vatican and the Nazi Hitler escape is something else. But several years ago, 10 years ago, I wrote, the SLA is the CIA. Why was Patricia Hearst kidnapped? And this article came out in 1974 in The Realist, just before the government hearings on Operation Chaos, and then later they fit exactly. It had a title on the destabilization of the government by the Army, the Navy, and the intelligence systems, the FBI, the local police, on taking over America, creating the illusion of a terrorist organization, and experimenting on various things from kidnapping to mind control. And I had 15 reasons why the SLA was set up by the CIA, and I'm not going to read them all. We don't have time. But reason 13 was to link the demons and the devil to communists, to leftists, to so-called deviants from government lines who don't believe the official government lines, to compare them to the right-thinking Christians, and to use strong-arm tactics to bring in the Christianity. And I gave examples in the article. The SLA is the CIA of Colston Westbrook, who was trained in the CIA at the Christian University in Tokyo in his mind control programs. Wes Davis, who belonged to the Christian organization World Humanity Against Totalitarianism, not against Argentine totalitarianism, against a Soviet, okay? And then it went into William Buckley telling Randolph Hearst, don't rescue your daughter. She should be sacrificed in the name of Christ. Buckley also Sovereign Military Order of Malta. And it goes into the Nazi Party in the Bay Area and the cyanide bullets, killing Dr. Marcus Foster. His friend Dr. Blackburn had regular bullets. He lived. The black man got cyanide. Cyanide is a Nazi weapon, a signal of world Nazism, and that's why it's so important with the Tylenol case. Now, getting off of the SLA and into the Bay Area, a long suppressed story, 2 or 3 weeks suppressed here, and finally broke front page of the Chronicle, national newspaper. People are working on it. There was a murder of Joseph Hoover, 17 years old, working in Oroville, California with Red Warthen, W-A-R-T-H-A-N, Red Warthen, the leader of the Nazi Party in California, who is going to be the national Nazi leader to link up with the international Nazis. He has regular meetings, happy birthday to Hitler, and so forth. And in the article about Warthen and the California Nazis, it refers to Antarctica and Hitler's super race and the Holocaust. They want to eliminate the blacks or separate them. And he again refers to Hitler and the Fuhrer and his close association. Now, one of the fellows who went to the police department, they referred to him as a snitch. He got 8 bullets, .22, in the back of the head, but he was dead 2 weeks. And the black community was objecting to the recruiting and the dial-a-phone of Nazi messages. And the reason it's hushed up is, I believe, not only because it links to the international Nazis, because it'll link to the Tylenol scare and the politicization and the fear of America. The Tylenol scare in Chicago has taken over from what the SLA did out here in 1974 by the same people. Now, Greg, G-R-E-G, Blagg, B-L-A-G-G, a gentleman from Oroville, California, had some poisoning. He survived the poisoning. This happened to be strychnine and not the cyanide, and he survived it. But they were testing him because he had had the extra strength Tylenol when he got sick. This was September the 30th. The Chicago authorities said, well, there's no relationships. 6 people then had died, and they ruled that out. But that was in Oroville. It was written up also in Newsweek, October the 18th, 1982. But the important thing is that the same issue of Newsweek, because that's more available for you than some of the local stories, has also a picture of the student, Mr. Pasquale, P-A-S-C-U-A-L, from the University of Pennsylvania, William Pasquale, who died last April, and they called it suicide, and they opened up the case again because it was a cyanide death, an apparent suicide. John Judge in Philadelphia investigated the University of Pennsylvania. Mr. Pasquale was active in the anti-Marcos campaign in Pennsylvania. He was a student there who was objecting to the Philippines politics, and many people in the United States that you think are apparent heart attacks, apparent suicides, are absolutely being murdered. I've said this for years, and when they exhumed this person, they said there's no link to the Chicago case, but there was a heavy residue of cyanide in his place, and this was an opponent to Marcos. I don't know if you realize the pattern in Germany when so many people died that were opponents to Adolf Hitler. In many towns and in many countries, in Europe before Hitler even marched in France and various countries, in Holland, Netherlands, and so forth, were being killed, the opponents to Hitler. Now, these people look like random cases, but I doubt, with the Oroville case and with the Pennsylvania case and the politics, it is necessary to go into each case of the cyanide and the deaths and the scare tactics that are going around the country. But the very important politicization of this issue comes on the front page of the New York Times. Investigator Anonymous, Tyrone Clarence Fahner, Clarence. I put on the printed sheet here Clearance because he's letting everybody off and prolonging this to stretch it out like the SLA for 18 months. Fahner was appointed as the state attorney general, and now he's running for election, and his name was unknown until the Tylenol case came. And the New York Times said, when people asked in Chicago, do you know Mr. Fahner, the Illinois attorney general who's heading the special force investigating the 7 deaths, they didn't know him, but his name became a household word. So he didn't have to spend $1 or $2 million to become or run for attorney general of the state of Illinois. He had the Tylenol, he had press conferences, he was in charge of it. It was like Ebel Younger being in charge of the Robert Kennedy investigation in Los Angeles and becoming the attorney general for the state of California. Interestingly enough, this man was appointed to the post by the governor to take over from William Scott, the other attorney general who went to jail in 1980. Scott was charged with, he was married, he had some woman courier, he had Swiss bank accounts, he had money overseas. He just got out of jail last week. Incidentally, he's been in jail. But one of the attorneys representing that crook in Illinois was Vincent Bugliosi, the fellow who covered up the entire narcotics CIA government role in the Manson family and creating the Manson family. And so Mr. Fahner, who is running for election tomorrow, we'll see whether he gets it or not in Illinois, became well known. He didn't have to do any more work because he had the great Tylenol case and press coverage every single day. Well, what kind of a job would a crook like that do if he were really letting them off the hook? We swing now to the very important story that was in the Chicago Tribune, and I do think this takes precedence over DeLorean, is the chemical infusion into our bodies, into our minds, the scare of what's going on in this country, particularly since I haven't seen Bayer aspirin be touched yet, and that is the IG Farben Corporation that wants to control the world for that 1,000-year Reich. Suspect James Lewis, who uses his other alias when he sends his letters, but everyone knows who he is, Mr. Richardson, he's the fellow from Kansas City who has an overseas business with pharmaceutical concerns, who was accused of severing the legs and limbs of a friend and neighbor and got off that rap, who's wanted on federal charges for state and tax offices. He had real estate offices and fraud. He's wanted on federal charges. He goes to Illinois, and his wife has a new Social Security card, an alias. He has 11 aliases or more. And this fellow's the one who wrote the extortion note wanting $1 million to be put in the Continental Illinois, again, the bank that is funding all these various subjects that I've been talking on the air for the last years, everywhere from Michael Sindona to David Kennedy, from the Vatican to the Utah Mormon Church and out to 20th Century Fox, and Cardinal Cody with his woman in Chicago. This suspect sent a letter. He said this was no way to treat a person. He says he never become an informant. Never try to be a good citizen unless you are prepared for the same treatment by the police and the FBI. Now, this Mr. Lewis wanted a travel agency in Chicago to get in trouble because they were involved in illegal money-making schemes. You've heard that one before. He says he worked for the police and FBI. He wrote an article for the Tribune last July, and he had to send in his picture to get his $50, although he was using his famous alias. And he sends in his picture, and then they accuse him, when he sends the note, give me $1 million, the extortion note, under the name of Robert Richardson. The picture was released by the Chicago Tribune. Then the Kansas City people said, oh, he's wanted on federal charges. Here is what I've been saying for a long time. The FBI uses people like Donald DeFreeze and other agents for counterintelligence, for a role, bring down the system, and we'll nab certain people we want. We'll cause the scare and terror, just as Donald DeFreeze was used in the SLA story. Mr. Lewis works, according to him, for the FBI and the police. He's written for the Chicago Tribune. His wife worked for that travel agency. He wanted his million into the Continental Illinois. And he complained this last week because he says he's an agent. And that is very important because the travel agency is not being investigated by Mr. Fahner. He says that has nothing to do with the case, just as the Philadelphia poisoning has nothing or the Oroville, California has nothing. But they're not going to go into the travel agency that was to get $1 million out of the Continental Illinois if it went in there, because, as explained, if it went to the Lakeside Travel Agency, which quickly closed, the former agency, it could have by error cable been sent out of the country and it wouldn't be traceable again. Now, the other person involved besides Mr. Lewis and his wife, this is a team, is that Mr. Arnold, that very interesting Mr. Arnold. They've let him out on just a little bit of $1,000 bail, I read one place, and $6,000 bail on the other because he had illegal firearms. Roger Arnold was arrested for possessing 5 unregulated weapons. Compelling coincidences, Mr. Fahner said in Illinois, make him interesting, but he had nothing to do with the Tylenol. This is what they're saying. There was cyanide in his house. He worked in the company, one of the companies, that the grocery chain that sold 2 of the contaminated bottles. His former wife was hospitalized. She had taken this Tylenol 6 months ago and got deathly ill, and just incidentally ended up in a mental hospital. Goodness knows what they're doing or experimenting with her there, because maybe she blew the whistle 6 months ago. She was sick from this stuff that her husband had given her. Across the street, he was visiting her at the mental hospital. Across the street was a place where people did, in fact, get some Tylenol lace that was fatal to them. 6 months ago, he was interested in chemistry. Chemicals were delivered to his house. He had given her, as I say, the Tylenol. He worked at the Jewel Food Warehouse, and that was involved in this story, a grocery chain that sold 2 of the contaminated bottles. And when he was picked up on the weapons charge, they went into his house to search it. They did find Tylenol and so forth. He had 2 tickets to Thailand, 2 one-way tickets to Thailand. He not only was going to Thailand and was able, working as a clerk at the grocery store, to go there, but according to the Chicago papers and the San Francisco Examiner, he's been there before. He's been to China, he's been to Hong Kong, and he had 2 airlines. Now, I'll call him Mr. Manson family Fahner from Illinois, F-A-H-N-E-R again, who wants to be the Attorney General. We'll have to know until tomorrow if he wins his fame through this terrible thing that's continuing, and he will continue to cover it up. I'll see how far he goes with Mr. Arnold, but they link of a travel agency in one case to the Lewises. They work closely. His wife worked with a travel agency in Chicago. He had an overseas import-export in Kansas. It involved a pharmaceutical concern or concerns. Goodness knows how it might branch out overseas. And here's a guy who travels frequently overseas to countries where, of course, he can do a lot of damage and pick up a lot of chemicals that he needs also that may not be sold in this country, although he did have chemicals delivered to him in this country, including cyanide in his apartment. So he's loose, and Mr. Lewis and his wife are loose, and Mr. Tyrone Fahner is running this, as I say, like Evel Younger did as a district attorney in Los Angeles with the Robert Kennedy case, and stretching it out with the Sirhan lies of the fatal bullet from Sirhan, and then they want to be the attorney general of their states. And this is the politicization of the Tylenol scare. Now, there was an interesting case in the Tylenol story that involves a similarity to all the other major conspiracies, the doubles. And I do want to mention that at O'Hare Airport, according to the Los Angeles Times, a biochemist flying from Chicago to New Orleans was the identical twin for the Lewis family, for Mr. and Mrs. Lewis. They were at O'Hare Airport. The police saw them and recognized them. Allegedly, there was a poster out about the Lewises, people looking for them, and the 2-year-old child of the biochemist said, "Oh, look, there's Mommy and there's Daddy," thinking it was their parents, the identical eyeglasses and the looks. In the Warren Commission hearings, you find an example at a furniture store where Lee and Marina Oswald were allegedly there with their 2-year-old daughter and their new baby, born the month before, a Russian-speaking woman. And no way Marina Oswald was never in that store, and it was a double of the entire family. And later I talked to Marina Oswald, and she told me about a farm in Texas she went to where Marina and Lee and the two children, right down to the accent and everything, were visiting people under the role of Lee and Marina Oswald, and she met them, and there wasn't any such visit of herself and Lee or the baby and the daughter to the family. We'll take a 1-minute break now, and then I'll be back on part 2 of broadcast number 569. They really add up quickly. This is Mae Brussell on KAZU FM in Pacific Grove, California. This is broadcast number 569, November the 1st, 1982. It's Mae Brussell and KAZU FM in Pacific Grove, California. I'm not going to do too much about the elections because by the time the tape subscribers get the cassette, the elections are over. We can analyze the winners or losers because what I say this evening won't have much effect on the election. I get disgusted with a lot of people who vote independent when out here particularly we should be voting against a particular Pete Wilson in San Diego, but I don't have any fear about that now because he's so corrupt and so linked to the vast corruptions that if he wins, just as Richard Nixon won in 1972, Pete Wilson has to pay at least $70,000 in back taxes. That won't be hard with the kind of people behind him, but then you investigate the people behind him. So we'll analyze that later, and in case you think I was hard on the Republican candidate, I might tell you that the chairman of the Democratic National Committee, banker Charles T. Manatt, M-A-N-A-T-T, is on the board of Flying Tiger International. That's known as Air Opium, also linked to Kirk Kerkorian and that Neil Berg saga I referred to on the first side of the broadcast. The Flying Tigers got started as the arms to Chinese nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek in the 1930s. If you don't know how he doped China, you might read some books on Southeast Asia and the doping of that country and the collection of huge amounts of capital by the ruling class by doping the masses and trading in narcotics. They went on later to open up Southeast Asia's Golden Triangle via the great Flying Tigers, Air America. It's widely acknowledged or recognized as a CIA front, and Democratic National Committee Chairman Mr. Manatt is on the board along with Madame Chennault from that organization, whose husband was the original flyer of Air Opium, is on the board of directors of 20th Century Fox, along with, you see the connection there, Marvin Davis and Frank Sinatra, his closest friend. We don't detail 20th tonight, but I think you get where the Democratic National Committee chairman is on the board of Air Opium. And so it goes. I've said before, and I'll keep reporting it for new listeners or for old listeners, when you vote for a president of the United States, you're voting for one narcotic route versus the other. If they're going to drive the cocaine route from Colombia, then they'll let the Bolivia flow. If one president comes in, he'll bring it in from Peru with the Peru King. There are turfs, just as the country was divided up after the Appalachian meeting in 1957. There are turfs of narcotic traffic, and until we get the dope out, O-U-T, out of this country and out of the White House and out of the Attorney General's offices, you will see increasing deaths, increasing murders, corporations going bankrupt, and more crime than you can visualize. What is described as terrorism is nothing compared to what the dope money does, or what that $60 million would do in the streets of Los Angeles that DeLorean would have spread around to put the cash in his own little corporation to keep his image of one of the beautiful people. Now, for several weeks I've mentioned the role of Attorney General William French Smith in the Operation Swordfish, calling attention to the arrests that were going to take place in Florida 4 hours before, so that 16 to 26 people escaped. Now, in the last week, in the course of 8 days or so, William French Smith has made major errors in the 4 largest drug cases in the United States that encompass the world drug market, and he should be removed as much as John Mitchell was removed at the time of Watergate. Operation Swordfish was one in September 26, where 16 to 26 people flew away from the Miami area, and that included the white upper class, the doctors, the bankers, the DeLoreans, the lawyers, and he let that element free because very important people got away, and it will reduce the ability to prosecute these people. Operation TikTok was thrown out last week, or just the beginning of the month, 1,000 hours of tape recordings were thrown out. That's that large 18-month investigation in Florida. Now, that involved the schleppers, not the bankers and the lawyers and doctors. That involved the CIA anti-Castro Cubans that murdered everyone from John Kennedy, working with Frank Sturgis, Frank Fiorino, through Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Salvador Allende, Letelier, blowing up the Cuban airlines, blowing up airports, people's legs falling off in Miami. The international terrorist group involved with the huge cocaine, narcotics traffic that ties into the CIA assassins and the Nuganan Bank in Australia. The Nazis, the assassins, and the Defense Department, admirals from the Nuganan Bank, and generals also. But Operation TikTok was thrown out. The excuse for wiretapping people is to get organized crime or drug people. And when they had 1,000 hours of tape, the judge had to let none of that be admissible, because that went right up to George Bush, the vice president, who was CIA director in charge of the Nuganan operation as the director when heroin cocaine from Southeast Asia was pouring into 16 major countries and used for assassinations, and in return they kept the profit from the dopes. Operation TikTok was thrown out January the 1st. William French Smith said he was going to be hard on the drug people. That was thrown out. John DeLorean and William M. Morgan Hetrick were arrested, along with their other co-worker, Mr. Arrington. We'll do on that next week. But 11 to 14 pilots left the country. 28 banks were emptied. They knew where the banks were. They knew how many pilots. That's the Hollywood connections that goes up to Ronald Reagan and up to Santa Barbara and Camarillo and down to the scenes of the actors and the John Belushi hit. Okay, up on La Cienega, the dope dealers from Hollywood, the major entertainment people, the Johnny Carsons and the Sammy Davises and company, and through the entire Republican and Democratic parties. Hetrick was a well-known, one of the largest drug dealers in the country. He was being investigated or watched when John DeLorean, a long friend of his, connected. They let the pilots get away, and the overseas banks and the California banks go just as identical to Watergate, when they went to Maurice Stan's office and shredded night and day what was in there. And then the murder of Kevin Mulcahy, primary witness against a man. He's so important, Edwin Wilson. He's on $20 million bond, and he's been locked up. He's so important. Kevin said his life was in danger for 5 years. He's been trying to get the CIA and the FBI and the Justice Department to find out what is going on with the Central Intelligence Agency arming Gaddafi, training schools of terrorists, plans to blow up the oil in the Middle East. He made outrageous allegations, and the trial was starting, and he was a primary witness. And instead of giving him protection, he takes CIA documents and goes to a cabin and pays a month's rent when the trial was supposed to begin in Houston, Texas, for Edwin Wilson, sending explosives on commercial airlines. You may think, well, this is academic, what Mae is talking about. I can't understand it. But when a plane blows up, the Pan Am leaving New Orleans and completely shatters, there are explosives on it. And next week I'll talk about Mr. Hetrick, DeLorean's pal, who has been a primary witness for trials where planes have blown up. He's an expert on airplanes, and Edwin Wilson and company are experts on blowing them up. So you get both ends. One blows it up and the other testifies. And meanwhile, the real experts can't find the cause of the accidents. But the truth is that the experts or the people who do the autopsies and the experts on the airline crashes that you or your loved ones are going to be on or were on are also linked with the people who blow up the planes, and this can be documented through articles and court cases over and over again. Well, Kelvin said for several years he was afraid he would die. The headlines of some of the stories: ex-CIA man who informed on Libya conspirators found dead. You get the word if you're an informant. That's what Mr. Lewis says, alias that Richardson. Out of the Tylenol case, he says, this is the thanks I get for helping the police and the FBI. You put my picture in the paper. Okay. The ex-CIA man who informed is dead. Catch that? Any other agents? Former CIA whistleblower found dead. That's another headline. Get the message? Don't be a whistleblower. Like Martha Mitchell, who said, I saw something dirty in the White House, and she was injected with a needle. The phone was pulled off the wall, and she never saw her daughter for 3 years and died that cancer. Another headline: Libya CIA case witness dies. Witness in the CIA case okay? Not ex-CIA, headlines in the Chronicle, CIA. Authorities still unsure how CIA man died. This time they call him the ex. They're unsure how he died. And this is very important because the CIA has perfected and told us 3,000 times they made medications that killed you without a trace. So why are they spending so long figuring out how he died? Why don't they go into what he was saying? You'll never find it on an autopsy. Headline, New York Times, autopsy draws a blank in death of CIA witness. Why don't they have the quotation of the CIA people themselves from the top on down who say you die without a trace? The guy has no bullets. He doesn't have emphysema. He wasn't drunk. He didn't have a lung condition. There was nothing to show how he died except that he had these documents in his place and a lot of crazy circumstances such as the death of Grace Kelly. But why sit and worry? Another story headline, was CIA analyst really poisoned? Really poisoned. And ex-CIA aide had pneumonia when he died, but the tests explored the possibility of poisoning. Kevin Mulcahy goes along with the Great Britain investigation of Roberta Calvi, a suicide hanging over that bridge the way he was found. Everybody in Europe, every single person except the London police, and they know it too, know that Roberta Calvi was murdered. He had 11 bodyguards because his best friend had his knees blown out a few weeks before, and he said that was for me. That message was for me, but he didn't have his bodyguards the night that he was hanging over that bridge in London, and Kevin goes into the same category. Why was Kevin Mulcahy important? Maybe next week I'll do 1/2 hour on some of the Kevin Mulcahy statements. What he left behind is for you to carry your legacy. That's what's important. He's gone now. He lived, he died, but he had enough in print to tell you, the future generation, of what to do. Now, I'm going to zero in on two elements, or one major element of the contribution of Kevin Mulcahy and what he knew. And this has to do, again, with one of my favorite subjects, which is Helene vonDamm, because she's so important. She's been, Ronald Reagan wants to appoint her the ambassador to Vienna. That's Steve Sagan's full circle again, from Vienna to Vienna, where her mother lives. And I'm going to give you some points here. It'll be on the sheet that accompanies the tape, not in such detail. But here is what Kevin was doing and how it affects the appointment of Helene vonDamm in Vienna. He had to be killed because of what he knew what Ronald Reagan's going to do in the future, as much as what he said. He said already what was happening, and if we investigated that, you'd understand the picture. As I said before, I'm putting this in chronological order. William Clark of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, the Vatican Knight, brought Helene vonDamm to this country when she first came here, and he is the National Security Advisor now. He took over Henry Kissinger's job, and he was in counterintelligence in Europe when he brought over his Swiss wife and Helene vonDamm from Vienna. She also was brought under the Reinhard Gehlen organization of Hitler's major spy agency that set up the CIA. She was set up, second point, in Detroit, the home of John DeLorean, Henry Ford and the Motor Company, the Lindbergh, Morgan, Hitler, Mussolini, Money Channel, as well as the anti-Semitic literature coming out of Detroit. I could give you who's who of Detroit and New Jersey, and there are links that come up in almost every single case now, including like the Continental Bank of Illinois. She went to Detroit and worked for a medical association. Warner Lambert, of course, again, the American Cancer Society, working with Otto von Bolschwing. She stayed in Detroit until Ronald Reagan became governor in California. Point 3, Reagan is governor in 1968 to 1974. Helene vonDamm comes to California and becomes the secretary of the new Fuhrer, that's Ronald Reagan, put together by Stanford University and the Tsarist White Russians from the time he was an early star in Hollywood. She works for him 8 years. And in that time, in the year 1971 to 1972, and there was years of terrible turmoil, she not only works for Ronald Reagan, but simultaneously invests her own money and is a translator secretary for a corporation set up called TCI in Sacramento. Now, many of you have heard this route before, but then I'm going to take it one step further to Kevin Mulcahy and the appointment of Helene in Vienna. She is working simultaneously for Ronald Reagan while she's working for a firm that was set up, TCI, by 6 people were used as a front, and then came in the big heavies, John Paul Getty and Mr. Senakis and the head of Fairchild and the Otto von Bolschwing organization. After it was set up, they came in while she was working for them, headquarters in Sunnyvale, California, and in Sacramento. Point number 5, while TCI was set up, they then offered and splintered into various groups that went into heavy electronic surveillance, into atomic weapons with Gulf, in Long Beach with the Shah of Iran, and listening posts, and setting up that Odessa spy network through the corporate cover. And in Sunnyvale, California, as part of that came Frank Turple, the fellow who puts rats on stomachs to eat them out while you're alive, and tortures and set up the torture equipment for Idi Amin and weapons for Gaddafi. Frank Turple worked with Stanford Technology and Edwin Wilson, too, when he was working for Edwin Wilson and Theodore Shackley and Thomas Kleins of the Central Intelligence Counterintelligence Operations, violently anti-Semitic, all linked to world Nazis. Frank Turple enters the Sunnyvale Stanford Technology Group, which is part of TCI, while Helene is working. Now, Frank Turple is working in Washington, D.C., with Edwin Wilson in the offices out of Washington, D.C., that Kevin Mulcahy joins. And I'll give you a closer biography next week on Kevin. He joins that firm. His father is 22 years with the CIA from the time, I guess it was the OSS till the CIA. He gets the highest commendations. His brothers are in the CIA. And he is set in Edwin Wilson's office. Now, on the board of Edwin Wilson's office, he's long CIA. He worked with Theodore Shackley. He was one of the paymasters for the Bay of Pigs and the arrangement of the murder of John Kennedy with the anti-Castro Cubans. In the offices of Edwin Wilson in Washington, D.C., he switches like from a CIA cover to Navy Intelligence Task Force 157 that George Bush was the head of, and when he was CIA director. And in that office, 1970 to 1975, is a man named Robert Gray. He's on the board of directors of the CIA Extermination Counterintelligence Anti-Semitic faction in Washington, D.C., the Nazi Odessa Network. Robert Gray works 5 years with Edwin Wilson, Frank Turple, and Kevin Mulcahy. 1970 to 1975, he's with Edwin Wilson. He's on the board. Now, Robert Gray moves on later to become in charge of Ronald Reagan's inauguration committee. Ronald Reagan has left California. He's had 8 years of testing himself, his riots, his SLA, his CIA that was done here in California with this Nazi Operation Chaos coming out of Washington and the military. He's now going to be president. He won the election. Robert Gray is in charge of the inauguration committee. That's when they invite their buddy, Frank Sinatra, to put on the inaugural ball, and Licio Gelli, who has fled recently. He's now in Switzerland, the one who fled to Argentina, the head of the secret Masonic Nazi group I mentioned earlier on the other side. Robert Gray, along with Helene vonDamm, they're in the transition team. They're going to Washington. She's to have a room right next to Ronald Reagan. She approves of the cabinet positions, the marshal position. She's anybody escorting criminals. Helene vonDamm is in charge of all appointments right now, and she'll go to Vienna if we let her and don't send enough letters. Now, Robert Gray is in charge of Ronald Reagan's inauguration in Washington, D.C., after having come 5 years on the board of Edwin Wilson with Theodore Shackley, Frank Turple, the Kevin Mulcahy connections. Work closely in Washington, transition team, the inauguration, and so forth. Helene vonDamm, Ronald Reagan, Robert Gray, Edwin Wilson, and company. Okay, now, point number 7. When Edwin Wilson's organization sent Frank Turple and Kevin Mulcahy to London, Kevin was meeting with a man, Sven, S-V-E-N, Hoffeiner, Hoffeiner. He's a Viennese. He's from Vienna, like Helene vonDamm. He comes from Vienna, has restaurants in London, and Kevin went to a yacht party with that was given by Sven and made a mistake of taking his camera. And he was apprehended. He worked very well with Frank Turple, who was sending murderous equipment all over the world. He worked very well with them, but he made the mistake of taking some pictures. Who was on the yacht? The famous Carlos the Jackal, Carlos Ramirez, the man who engineered the Munich Games, the killing of the Jewish athletes, the fellow in charge of Rome's it's spelled Fiumicino. I don't pronounce Italian. Fiumicino Airport in Rome, the Paris murders, airport hijackings, the Israeli airline that went down to Uganda, you name it. Carlos, there are many books on Carlos, you can get them. Carlos the Jackal, one of the most vicious Nazi anti-Semites, was socializing with Kevin Mulcahy, and Kevin was told, well, don't take your camera, but Kevin told Seymour Hersh of the New York Times, and it was printed in the New York Times, the role of Kevin with these people and socializing with Carlos. The story that Interpol or the international police want Carlos is a crock of what Pete Wilson makes to get a tax write-off in Texas, okay? Now, these people were working together. Mrs. Helene vonDamm keeps the German name. Her husband, Byron Leeds, met her when he was in the army in Vienna. She wants to be the ambassador to Vienna, and the Viennese provider of the weapons for South Africa. He diverted weapons that were going to Libya and Uganda also, and to the PLO, and arming the PLO were being diverted to South Africa. And this particular fellow from Vienna should be checked out, Sven Hoffeiner, Hoffeiner. Now, were Kevin Mulcahy's allegations true? I believed he died for them, and I think we should check into them. But if you want to verify them, look at the newspapers this past week on holding up the funds of the United States to the United Nations, because the United Nations was funding, until somebody caught on, the School for Terrorism under the guise of a trade school run by the PLO. There were stories in the San Francisco Chronicle, New York Times on this school. The story is that the trade school in Beirut, Lebanon, was run by the United Nations Relief Fund. The money was sent by the United Nations, by us and tax dollars, into Beirut. The United Nations put $67 million into this fund, $67 million out of a $161 million agency budget for this. And the United States was holding back $15 million just last week, but I understand the school has changed locations now. The United Nations Relief and Works Agency has been training Palestinians and sending money since 1950, and there's a school called the Siblin Training Center, Siblin Training Center, for Relief Works Agency, and the money comes out of Vienna, from Vienna to the Siblin Trade Agency. A man named Olaf Fydbeck, O-L-E-F, that's his first name, F-Y-D-B-E-C-A, the Commissioner General in Vienna, sent the money by the United Nations to Beirut, Lebanon. Now, what was the training school? In order to have a trade in for the PLO, those poor people, the relief fund that we're sending to them so they can learn to be teachers or pharmacists or whatever it is, or for agricultural training. If you don't want to live in a tent and you want to go to the UN school, you go to the trade school, the Siblin Training Center. But you take several years of your trade, but simultaneously, you can't get your degree until you have 1 year of terrorism. And down in the basement of the school, the United States was sending weapons, and when they went into the school, there were in the locker basement 500 automatic rocket rifles, 20 rocket-propelled grenade launchers, ammunition, radio equipment. One of the conditions of getting a degree to have a skill out of the PLO run by the United Nations was that you have to be a terrorist for 1 year. You have to bomb, you have to kill, you have to throw grenades, then come back and we'll let you be a teacher. So if you hired a former PLO through the United Nations Fund, it comes through Vienna. Again, a Viennese in London with Wilson Turple, Kevin Mulcahy, who is funding South Africa, Idi Amin, and planning to blow up oil wells in the Middle East for maybe American oil companies. I can't even imagine why, and I've talked about Kevin's allegations on that before. But it's important because he was socializing with Carlos. Now, we get propaganda out of Reader's Digest, out of ABC News, NBC, you name it. Claire Sterling has written a book, The Terror Network, and I have the book, unfortunately. I have to use it for research. They want to blame radical, impoverished third world people and the Soviet Union for this link that goes all over the world for terrorism. And yet the United Nations knowingly has a school in the basement, and the part of the exercises after school and before school are in military training, in training people to blow up bridges, to blow up trains. And if you think there's been too many trains spilled lately or too many major crashes, believe me that they've been trained in skills and they're exercising their muscle in kidnapping and bombing and so forth, to bring on this great Armageddon that those Christian churches are funded by this Nazi overseas money, these Bible churches on television, millions and billions of missing money, telling you that the third war, the Holocaust, the Armageddon will take place in the Middle East. Meanwhile, very real people with real names in real cities are identifying that it isn't a biblical prophecy. This is very important to get into our heads. These are people giving millions and many, many millions out of an organization, say, the United Nations could send that to train people in impoverished areas to feed themselves and have water and homes. Instead, we give it to World Vision, which is a Christian CIA front, like a lot of these other organizations that are informers in Cambodia and overturned companies in Guatemala and so forth. And the John Hinckley family, of course, was closely aligned to that. These PLO training schools exist, and I'm sure that there isn't just one isolated case where they're trained. In Beirut, Lebanon isn't the only place where they're trained. Gaddafi still has a lot of the technology and the ammunition that we send over there. But the important thing is that people in our government, who I really think are mentally sick, and I also think that the only thing to explain this to them and to ourselves is a holy war, and I go back again to the Inquisition and the Middle Ages. Every single person involved with Kevin Mulcahy and Edwin Wilson and Frank Turple, their superiors, belongs to an organization, the Sovereign Military Order of Malta. They've been knighted. Their allegiance is to keep the Church of Rome on top, no matter what, and the means justifies the end. If James Angleton of the CIA, and I mention again the people that belong to this organization, Robert Ablanap down in the Bahamas, Richard Nixon's friend, Joseph Bettinger founded the Bilderbergers with Prince Bernhard, William and James Buckley, William Casey, William Clark, Mr. Peter Flanagan from Nixon's team, Alexander Haig, belonging to these grand lodges to the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, John McCone, Vernon Walters, J. Peter Grace, Reinhard Galen, they all belong to two organizations. One is Rome and the other is the Central Intelligence Agency, and the local police, again, funneled down from there. The Vienna connections have never ended. When Hitler left, whether he died or escaped, the Vienna connections to Carlos, to London, to the American intelligence is intact. In Beirut, to get a trade, you have to get money from Vienna, from United Nations Relief Fund, and go to bombing school. Now, we held up a few $1 million last week, $15 million, to see what was going on. But there's no accounting for 100, 200, 300 million that went there before. Remember Mark David Chapman, who shot John Lennon, and will do the anniversary of Lennon in 1 month, went to Beirut, Lebanon for 6 months, came home an expert killer, and everybody said, well, he didn't have any training for shooting. He stood down and aimed, got John with one bullet. He was trained in Beirut, Lebanon by the same CIA that have been sending money to Beirut for that purpose, to get rid of people who have mass demonstrations for peace and otherwise. Well, I think we've covered a lot of material. I do want next week to go into the allegations of Kevin, because he, as I say before, he is dead, but what he said is alive. And why did he come forward and say these things to the FBI and the CIA? He came forward not because he's a pristine angel, but because he got sick of what they were doing, and he wanted to make sure that he had the CIA approval. So he went to the offices of Edwin Wilson to get some papers, and they had comments about references to killing somebody and getting rid of them and their murderous activities. And then among the papers, he found his own name, and his handwriting was forged, and they were going to make him responsible for things that were going to happen in the future. Now, that is very important, because the use of forgery has started World War I, World War II. It has covered up the murders of presidents and elections in this country, so that you have to have no choice but a Ronald Reagan. The others are all wiped out. There were forgeries of Oswald's diary, and he didn't kill John Kennedy. The forgery of Sirhan's diary, and he didn't do the fatal bullet in Robert Kennedy. And Martin Luther King and James Earl Ray's writings and comments in the biography of his family, that doesn't hold either. Incidentally, just to close on John DeLorean and interesting connections that I say who is behind all this, John DeLorean, when he's in New York City in his $5 million apartment, according to Time Magazine this week, goes to St. Patrick's on Fifth Avenue every single day. He's a devout Catholic, and St. Patrick's, if you remember my broadcast on the Sovereign Military Order of Malta with the Cardinal Cook and Cardinal Spellman, it is the headquarters of the United States Inquisition team. And I'm not anti-Catholic any more than I'm anti-Jewish, and I do promise in week or two to get into Begin, the Mussolini fascist material that was very valuable that was sent to me on explaining some more about Mr. Menachem Begin and his training with Mussolini and what he was doing in Poland to betray the Jews before he left there. But the important thing is that DeLorean is a devout Catholic, again, with international connections and national. Millions in Utah, in Nevada, companies, corporations, offshore banking, banks, 23 million or more in a Swiss bank. His car company was set up like that TCI in California, but he didn't go there. He didn't care about the cars. He didn't go to the meetings. He was hardly seen. Once the network was set up, he could do his international traveling for whatever it was for, but a daily visitor to St. Patrick's. More on that next week because I'm out of time now. This is Mae Brussell. It is KAZU FM in Pacific Grove, California. I'll be back with you next week.